So Jack has asked me to introduce one of the key concepts of today's session, which is the free city. Free cities are self-governing territories that uphold individual rights and freedoms. Now, you might be wondering why free cities are necessary to try out new governance models. So because free cities have the autonomy to make their own rules and regulations, they can potentially serve as test beds for trying out new approaches to governance in some of these core areas. A special economic zone is a general term for a bounded area within a country that has different rules and regulations from the rest of the country in which it's based. The Chinese government offered Shenzhen the freedom to experiment with different practices that were prohibited in the rest of the country at the time. Another place that's made extensive use of special economic zones is Dubai. The picture behind me shows a building in Prospera, a next generation special economic zone and aspiring free city. Free cities really remove all of the artificial barriers that stop those economies from emerging, and I think they will emerge naturally.
I see a marriage between free cities and Bitcoin circular economies. I would say that most Bitcoin circular economies don't have the legal framework that free cities have. It's global money that allows local communities to thrive by connecting them all together.
The way in which society is structured is profoundly affected by technology.
When you have hopelessness, you tend to have a lot of cynics, which can be dehumanizing, demoralizing, to say the least. You realize that you cannot fix the system from inside. You have to sidestep that system. And that's where zones for economic development and employment, empowerment, which are sometimes referenced as special economic zones, coupled with newer protocols such as Bitcoin, can assist or do assist. We have literally come across developers who came to us and says, I've been waiting for you guys for the last 10 years.
So Jack has asked me to introduce one of the key concepts of today's session, which is the free city. So the reason why free cities have become a topic of interest to Bitcoiners is that many of us live in countries that are starting to place restrictions on the use of Bitcoin as an alternative to conventional currency. So there's therefore naturally an interest amongst Bitcoin users in relocating to places where we know the use of Bitcoin will be protected and supported. Free cities are a new kind of jurisdiction that stands to provide that protection and support. And for that reason, they could very well end up becoming important to cultivating the Bitcoin circular economies that we are going to explore in this session. So in this presentation, I'm going to briefly explain what a free city is and why the concept can help us explore new ways of governing society. I'm then going to explain how free cities developed from a more established concept, which is the special economic zone. And finally, I'm going to give an example of an aspiring free city in Honduras called Prospera, which will help us to illustrate how this free cities concept is working in practice. So let me start then with a definition of a free city. Free cities are self-governing territories that uphold individual rights and freedoms. So the first element of that definition is that they're special zones within countries that are able to govern themselves relatively independently. This typically happens because there's some kind of agreement with a host government that grants the zone autonomy. The autonomy free cities have might allow them to set their own laws, establish their own regulations, manage their own public services, and issue their own residence permits. The second element of the definition relates to upholding individual rights. So as well as being autonomous, free cities are places that also have a strong emphasis on allowing individuals to exercise their voluntary choices without being subject to excessive regulations or excessive taxation. So the second part of that definition implies that free cities are relatively libertarian in their nature. The governments there, therefore, will generally play a much less hands-on role in the everyday lives of citizens than you might experience in a traditional nation state. What the governments of free cities do instead is provide a strong legal framework that supports free and voluntary cooperation between members of their community. One of the reasons why our organisation supports the idea of developing free cities is because we believe the world needs more innovation in governance. Establishing new autonomous free cities gives an opportunity for us to try out new approaches to governance in the 21st century. By doing that first at the city level, we also avoid some of the risks that come when you try to reform an entire country wholesale. Now, you might be wondering why free cities are necessary to try out new governance models, given that there are already around 200 countries in the world that are presumably doing this already. But the reality is that we're actually not seeing as much innovation as you might think. When you really drill down to the way that governments function, you find that there's a remarkable level of similarity in the core tools that they use. Let me illustrate this with a few examples. Firstly, the way that the government of almost every existing country in the world funds itself is through a complicated system of taxes. Within conventional taxation systems, the amount of tax owed varies from person to person and business to business. And the business or person is responsible for calculating exactly how much they owe themselves. Furthermore, there's generally very little relationship between what people contribute in taxes and what they receive from the state in return. This is in stark contrast to what happens in the business sector, where you typically will pay a fixed and predetermined amount in exchange for a clearly defined product or service. Another area of commonality is public services. Most states tend to deliver a range of public services, such as infrastructure, healthcare, and education, through centralized bureaucratic mechanisms. These services are primarily funded through taxation, and there is generally a limited role for market mechanisms in their delivery. Thirdly, there's a lot of commonality in monetary systems. Most states operate a financial system where a state-controlled central bank issues an inflationary currency that has certain legal privileges. These include being the mandated medium through which all taxes have to be paid. At the moment, there's perhaps only one country which is diverging from this traditional model, which is El Salvador. There are also some important similarities in terms of administration of justice, how national governments set their own unique regulations, and how countries maintain security for their populations. So because free cities have the autonomy to make their own rules and regulations, they can potentially serve as test beds for trying out new approaches to governance in some of these core areas. So if this sounds interesting to you, you might be wondering whether the idea of building free cities is actually realistic. Are countries really going to be willing to grant autonomy to certain regions so they can set their own laws and regulations? Well, I would argue that it is actually realistic to expect this. And the reason for that is that there are already many examples of countries that grant autonomy to regions by setting up something called special economic zones. So now we come to our next definition. A special economic zone is a general term for a bounded area within a country that has different rules and regulations from the rest of the country in which it's based. These differences might impact areas such as tariffs and taxation, business regulations, labor law, and government procedures. These zones are primarily used by countries as a means of stimulating growth, attracting foreign investment, and creating high-quality jobs. The story of special economic zones is not particularly well understood, but there are actually more than 7,000 of these zones across the globe. Their growth in number has quietly been taking place across the world over the past half century. You can see that growth plotted on a graph behind me. In the mid-1970s, there were less than 100 of these zones worldwide. But today, the number stands at more than 7,000. It's actually surpassed the top number featured on that chart. When we look at a map of the world, we can see that these zones are very numerous and distributed across 6 continents. So how did special economic zones come about? Well, the story of modern special economic zones started in Shannon Island in 1959. At the time, the Irish government was looking for a way to revive an airport that was declining in international traffic. What they decided to do was offer special tax exemptions to companies that chose to locate there. If someone listening is someone that enjoys duty-free shopping when they travel internationally, then they have Shannon to thank, because this place was the first site in the world to establish a duty-free shop. The zone was pretty successful, and it went on to inspire other zones that ended up becoming much more comprehensive in their scope. An example of that is Shenzhen in China. This is probably the most famous example of a subsequent special economic zone, and it was established in 1979, so 2 decades after Shannon. The Chinese government offered Shenzhen the freedom to experiment with different practices that were prohibited in the rest of the country at the time. This included allowing foreign companies to make direct investments in China, allowing people to buy and sell land, allowing Chinese people to set up their own private business, and relaxing the hukou system that limited internal migration for Chinese citizens. It served as a place where China, which at the time was a highly centralized socialist economy, could experiment with market reforms. As you can see in the pictures shown behind me, the reforms had a dramatic effect on Shenzhen's urban landscape. The city's economic growth averaged 20% per year between 1980 and 2020, and the policies adopted there ended up being copied across the whole of China. Another place that's made extensive use of special economic zones is Dubai. The Emirate has more than 30 of them in total. The first to be set up was Jebel Ali Free Zone in 1985, which remains one of the largest special economic zones in the world today. Another is Dubai International Financial Center, which was set up in 2004, and it's notable for being one of the first special economic zones to have its own independent legal system. You can see pictures of Dubai in 1980 and 2020 behind me. Special economic zones played a huge role in transforming Dubai into the vibrant global city we all know it as today. So to sum up, there have already been very many special economic zones that have been established around the world. Some of those zones have been very successful and gone on to have a broad impact on the countries in which they're based. Given this, I think it's not unreasonable to assume that forward-thinking governments will be willing to experiment with new kinds of zone that push the boundaries of zone autonomy. In fact, this is already starting to happen in places like Prospera in Honduras that I'm now going to introduce. The picture behind me shows a building in Prospera, a next generation special economic zone and aspiring free city being built in Honduras. Prospera spans 1,000 acres on the tropical island of Roatan and the coastal city of La Ceiba. Its goal is to foster economic growth and create high quality jobs, while also serving as a hub for innovative business. You can see some of the businesses that operate there pictured in the film that's showing on the screen. Despite only being established in 2018, Prospera has already attracted 1,400 e-residents that make use of governance services. And in addition to that, there are 120 full-time residents that live within the physical bounds of Prospera. Furthermore, the development is home to 170 registered businesses, which are engaged in industries ranging from smart manufacturing and drone technology to gene therapy and architecture and design. One of the reasons Prospera has been able to attract these businesses is because of the innovative governance model that it offers. As an aspiring free city, Prospera is trying out new approaches to governance in some of those core areas that I mentioned earlier in the presentation. Here are some examples. Firstly, Prospera is innovating in the way it funds itself by introducing membership fees. While it's not eliminated taxes completely, it's introduced a hybrid funding model. Taxes that the territory levies on residents are low and simple. You have a 5% individual income tax, 2.5% retail tax, 1% corporate tax, and 1% land tax. These low taxes are made possible because Prospera charges a fixed annual membership fee for people to be part of the community and use Prospera's governance services. The fee is $1,300 a year for foreigners and $280 for Hondurans. We can therefore see that this kind of hybrid funding model is starting to move away from that complicated conventional system that brings a lot of uncertainty to most taxpayers across the world. Another innovation relates to public services. Prospera is actually governed by a private operating company that has shareholders and therefore also a profit motive. This means that if Prospera isn't serving its residents well, then its shareholders lose money. This creates a different kind of incentive structure whereby Prospera is encouraged to deliver public services like infrastructure and security in a cost-effective way that meets the real needs of their citizens. A third example of where Prospera is innovating is in the use of currencies. It's possible to make use of multiple currencies within Prospera, and no special privilege is given to any individual currency. You can choose to operate your business using the Honduran lempira, the US dollar, any other national currency, or even Bitcoin if you choose. Prospera was the first jurisdiction in the world to make Bitcoin the equivalent of legal tender, which it did a few months before El Salvador. Prospera recently also became the first place in the world to allow businesses to use Bitcoin as a unit of account, meaning that they don't need to convert back to US dollars to calculate the taxes that they owe. There are also some very interesting innovations happening in the realm of the legal system, flexible regulations, and security systems, which I'm happy to go into in the discussion if that's of interest. So I hope this presentation has provided a helpful introduction to the concept of the free city, which we defined as a self-governing territory that upholds individual rights and freedoms. I hope it also helped to help you understand how free cities have emerged historically from special economic zones. We define those zones as bounded areas of countries that have their own rules and regulations. And finally, I hope it was helpful to learn about Prospera so you can see how the ideas that the Free Cities Foundation advocates are actually being implemented in reality. I only had time today to introduce one of the aspiring free city projects, but if you want to learn about others, you can check out profiles on the 15 projects that are featured on that map behind me by visiting free-communities.org. So thanks very much for listening. I'm going to now hand back over to Jack.
It's truly a wonderful, extremely rich presentation. I'm tempted to get your feedback. You know, we've framed the conversation. Now we've had some glimpses into what a Bitcoiner circular economy is, and Quentin has alluded to the notion of citadels. To what extent would you say that those Bitcoin citadels or circular economies reflect the vision behind the free cities? How much do they embrace the same kind of ambition of expanding the dimensions of freedom for the individuals?
Free cities can certainly be places where I can see these Bitcoin economies thriving. I mean, in general, the goal of free cities is that they support members of society to engage in voluntary free exchange and free interactions within a legal framework that protects everyone's individual rights. So you have, for example, clearly defined property rights for people if they want to run a business and exchange. You have certain rules about violating other people's property rights, and you have security. But beyond that, the system itself is really quite agnostic with regard to, what specific currencies people are using. But it tends to be quite popular with Bitcoiners because existing nation states often put obstacles in the way of these circular economies developing. For example, a lot of countries will treat Bitcoin as an asset that needs to be taxed when it rises in fiat value, rather than a commodity that can simply be exchanged like a currency without tax implications. So that's something that definitely wouldn't exist in a free city. You would treat this commodity like any other commodity, and it would have exemption from tax if you were able to, if you were using it in your transaction. And I think that in itself would really help to cultivate the economies that we've heard there in the presentation. It was very helpful for me to see how it's all laid out in terms of these various steps, how mature a particular Bitcoin circular economy can become. I've visited various places that are at different stages within that hierarchy. So, my local town, for example, there might be like one person that accepts Bitcoin. So we'd be stage one on that. We're not zero, but we have one person. So we would just about get onto the tier. And then I thought it was interesting what he said about the idea of a specific organization that is pushing forward Bitcoin adoption. That's something that exists in Madeira. I'm part of the Free Madeira advisory board that's kind of working on some of that stuff. So it's good to see that that's kind of listed as a key function. for like moving up the hierarchy there. And yeah, like I think probably the most developed circular economy that you've got is the one in El Zonte, Bitcoin Beach, which seems to have lots of those elements like specific organization, bespoke wallets, education campaigns. So it's very helpful for me to see it all set out. And I think what the connection with free cities would be is that free cities really remove all of the artificial barriers that stop those economies from emerging. And I think they will emerge naturally if you just remove the barriers and allow people to explore what their preferences are in terms of money and in terms of trading within a local economy.
Thanks, excellent. Quentin, do you want to make a further comment?
Yeah, I very much agree with what Peter just said. I see a marriage between free cities and Bitcoin circular economies. I would say that most Bitcoin circular economies don't have the legal framework that free cities have, which would be very helpful, though not an absolute necessity. We can see there are a lot of examples of Bitcoin circular economies in places that are not very friendly towards Bitcoin. But again, the goal is sovereignty at the local level, right? And I think that Bitcoin is great at both bringing back power to the localities and creating bridges between these islands of sovereignty, meshing them into a global network. And here I'd like to highlight that local and global are not mutually exclusive. They're complementary, and we can see that with Bitcoin. It's global money that allows local communities to thrive by connecting them all together and protecting them from the theft of their resources that is the result of fiat currencies and monetary inflation. And this is what we're trying to achieve with Mi Primer Bitcoin. We're trying to empower individuals with Bitcoin financial education by empowering the local communities of Bitcoin educators that do the hard work of educating their peers about Bitcoin. And we started with El Salvador because it had the legal framework that allowed us to create this example that can be replicated and adapted to all kinds of local contexts throughout the.
Thanks a lot, Quentin. I was going to make an input, a technical input in this discussion. You know, at first glance, whilst I was reflecting upon the relevance of organizing a conversation around the theme, I was thinking, you know, it seems to me that those Bitcoin circular economies are mainly about developing an alternative financial system, an alternative monetary system, whereby participants gradually adopt Bitcoin as a means of payment, then as a store of value, and eventually as a unit of account. And less as a circular economy in the industrial way that has been described by Maria. That is to say, you know, bringing efficiency and sustainability in the production and consumption process, promoting recycling, reuse, etc., better use of natural resources, etc. It seems to me that this intuition is proving quite correct so far. But it's my firm belief, really, that Bitcoin is fostering a more circular economy in the broader sense of the term. And I believe that this influence is both systemic and pervasive in many sectors. And we're yet to find all the use cases where Bitcoin is actually promoting circularity throughout the economy. Yeah, so I think we need to address the topic of the day from a technological perspective. I'm not the techie guy in the room, that's for sure. But I wanted to get your perspective, Peter and Ronnie, on those issues. Peter, when we prepared this conversation, we discussed the thesis of the sovereign individual. The Sovereign Individual is a book basically describing the importance of certain macro drivers for the evolution of humanity. And technology is certainly one of the 3 or 4 big macro drivers that are being described. Can you tell us more about it and what it means in terms of how society will tend to organize in the information age? What's happening in the past 50 years is the transition from the industrial age to the informational age, and the emergence of cryptography is one dimension of it. Can you explain to us how this transition, this technological breakthrough, is affecting, is influencing the way people organize in a society and the type of institutional setups that are going to evolve as a result?
Well, yeah, as you mentioned, The Sovereign Individual, I think it first came out in 1997. And it was a very interesting book because it made the case that there was the way in which society is structured is profoundly affected by technology. So there's this interesting chapter at the beginning of the book where it describes how states were able to gain the power that they have today, which largely came as a result of the Industrial Revolution, where most of the economic value being generated was taking place around factories. And factories, due to agglomeration benefits, were located in cities. So what you ended up having is large populations that were centered within a very small geographical area. And what that meant is that the politicians that were in charge of those areas were able to draw on a lot of resources in terms of taxes, because they had a population that was pretty much linked to this specific location. The population couldn't very easily move to another place. So they had these large amount of values being created in a small geographical area. And that led to states growing in power more and more. So you had previously it was like an agrarian society where population was scattered. Then you had this condensing of populations on urban centers. It makes the case that what we're seeing now in the information age is that the economy is moving further away from physical manufacturing and more towards intangible things. So services that are provided purely in the digital economy, like the FANG stocks, the Facebook, Google, Netflix, whatever. These companies are operating largely in the digital economy. And because they're digital, they can have premises that are based in different geographical jurisdictions, and they can structure their affairs so that it's very difficult for governments to tax them in the way they would in conventional states. And that same kind of technological trend, whereby more and more of us are moving into the digital economy, is starting to give citizens more power with respect to governments than they used to. Like now, if you're someone who's a computer programmer and you don't like the government that you're living under, you don't like the rules and regulations, the environment around you is not as safe or clean as you'd like, it's easier than ever to move to a different place and be subject to a different set of rules, different living environment, different tax regime. So this trend in general, I think, is really important for putting more power in the hands of individual people with respect to their governments. And what we're seeing with the Free Cities movement is that a lot of the people that are operating in that digital economy are coming to us and saying, we're maybe not 100% satisfied with the place we're living now. Is there somewhere else that we can live that better meets our needs? And that's essentially what Free Cities are doing. They're meeting the demand, firstly, for that globally mobile population. And then I think what's going to follow is, you start to see the digital nomads, the single travelers that can move easily, be followed then by families and people that want to establish a more permanent base. So the sovereign individual thesis, I think, is proved to be remarkably prophetic, and it's definitely influencing the trend towards people seeking out new jurisdictions, and it's influencing the demand for the kind of jurisdictions that we're working with in the Free Cities community.
Excellent. Yeah. Yeah. So here there's a clear indication that the technology is pushing towards more of this experimentation, more decentralization, and more growth of these alternative models, right?
Absolutely, yeah. There's people have more choice now, and so where there's a demand, I think you will eventually get a supply. Entrepreneurs will realize that there's this new demand for new kinds of jurisdiction, and there are actually customers now that we live in a world where people are mobile and can transport their economic value relatively frictionlessly. We're starting to see people who will wake up to that and create products and services in places that fulfill that demand.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Ronnie. I brought you on this roundtable because I met you a few weeks ago on Noster. It's an open source communication protocol, a bit like a free open source Twitter. And you're very much a technologist, a futuristic, visionary mind. You're also a wise man who has witnessed the struggle of mankind stuck into centralized system and systems which tend to intensify their stronghold on the individual. What is, in your view, the source of hopelessness, and where do you see hope at the moment? I forgot to say, you're one of those guys who are technically involved in the development of the technical layer of those free city and special economic zone experiments.
Jack, one of the things that we have seen over the years due to the controlling centralized system is typically a sense of hopelessness. And when you have hopelessness, you tend to have a lot of cynics, a lot of cynical involvement, which can be dehumanizing, demoralizing, to say the least. And that comes specifically from this whole concept of controlling centralized systems. When you recognize that in a holistic way, and you look at it from the broader picture of what I loosely call the masses, you realize that you cannot fix the system from inside. And whether we like it or not, whether we believe it or not, whether we accept it or not, you have to sidestep that system in order to come up with the hope that you would like to achieve. And that's where zones for economic development and employment, empowerment, which are sometimes referenced as special economic zones in certain regulatory frameworks, coupled with newer protocols such as Bitcoin, can assist or do assist. When you look at, yes, I do hang out in the Prospera Builders Network and others. But when you really look at these environments coupled with these protocols, Noster also being one, you recognize that sidestepping the system is no longer sci-fi. It's practical, it's pragmatic, and in my opinion, it's the only way forward if you're going to talk about hope, because it brings to bear a possibility for bespoke, creative, revolutionary solutions that can enable various societies to propel themselves without having a stranglehold or a millstone around their neck. And that's where, to be honest, that's where I see hope, in the decentralized protocols that we have, coupled with a lot of the frameworks, such as what you see in Prospera.
Right. Okay. When you're involved in those projects, Prospera or other upcoming embryonic, but maybe developing similar project and in other region of the world, generally speaking, it's a project. It's a government project. It's something that's done with the support of the government. And as Peter was mentioning, they are willing to experiment. They're willing. They need to have such boxes to stay up to date, or to anticipate changes, or to engage some sort of metamorphosis. How do you see this seeming contradiction between the apparent impossibility to reform themselves and this kind of escape towards increasing centralization and control, and as they're afraid to see the institutions at the moment are a bit obsolete in our countries, and they were developed. That's an interesting read as well, this fourth turning thing, which initially applies to the United States, but which is also a developing concept and principles applicable to the rest of the world. Typically, after a major crisis, such as a world war, you set up new institutions that are going to be relatively appropriate to the existing condition, demographic, economic, politic, you name it. And people are going to agree, partly because they've been so traumatized that they just need some peace. And the system works fairly well for a few decades, but gradually, you have entrenched interests that are starting to pervert the system and preventing the natural evolution that it would need to match the evolving circumstances. And now we end up in the current situations where basically in 2020 we are living in countries which institutions have not evolved as they should have, and the situation become quite explosive. So the government is stuck. It senses that chaos is brewing, that the population is not, as you say, the population is becoming cynical, the population is becoming hopeless, and it cannot really reform itself from within. But perhaps the solution, or part of the solution, is to start experimenting in small jurisdiction. Is that the way the nation states or whatever stakeholders involved in those experiments are playing the game, Peter?
I think you have to bear in mind about governments is that they're not singular entities. There's people often try and anthropomorphize governments as if they have one single personality and they act in a certain way, in a certain rational way, in order to kind of preserve their own interests. But in fact, governments are groupings of people that have their own individual interests. And there are people within governments that are very pleased with the system as it is, and they want to continue. The system is the system that got them to where they are. And so they also, they're very happy with perpetuating it. There are other people that get involved in politics because they have different motives. They might actually want to reform the system, move it in a less politically centralized direction. And I think one of the things that special economic zones allow you to do is allow some of the more reform-minded people an option for actually affecting some kind of change. Maybe it's not fully understood that this is happening by all of the other people that are agreeing to this, but typically it's a more effective way of actually changing things than trying to lobby a national government or trying to put a vote through Parliament. I mean, probably the best example of that is China, really, because China went through this really tumultuous period, really during all of the 20th century, but particularly during the communist period under Mao. There were all kinds of these political struggles going on. But the way it was able to reform was not by getting all those people in the center of Beijing to agree that a particular pathway that diverged from the old practices was appropriate. What they were able to do is say, okay, well, let's take a very small part of the country on the coast next to Hong Kong, and we will try out some new ideas there. And because they tried them out and because they worked, that ended up changing the whole debate in the country and moving things towards the more market-driven system that China now has today. So, in answer to your question, can they be how is there a tension between, on the one hand, states getting more centralized, and on the other, we're seeing this kind of fragmenting of political power in smaller jurisdictions? I think there is that tension. There are elements definitely that are growing stronger. There are the globalist kind of groups, that maybe the WEFs, the World Economic Forums of the world, that are sort of pushing us towards a more centralized and controlled system. But at the same time, there are also market forces and zones and technologies like Bitcoin are pulling in another direction. So I see that really as the current interplay we have. And I think that overall, the decentralizing forces are going to win out, because ultimately, they're the ones that are more efficient. They're the ones that deliver things that people want. Like, I think we've seen when we look back at history that systems that try and centralize and control ultimately don't succeed in the long run. And the systems that tend to succeed have more of at least a balance of centralization with decentralization.
Yeah. And they attract capital, in financial and human capital. And that's what Ronnie was telling me the other day. There's a lot of people who have not yet found how to harness their talents, their high competences in the existing system. And when they hear about open source protocols such as Bitcoin or Nostr, and they figure out that there's a community supporting them, they can affect great changes, right, Ronnie?
Yeah, we actually have that right now within our network, whereby we have literally come across developers who, one in particular, as I may have mentioned to you in the past few days, Jack, who came to us and says, I've been waiting for you guys for the last 10 years. And this is what happens when you harness and support an ecosystem of more than just creatives, but folks on the ground who can take decentralized and open source protocols and build technological bespoke solutions on top of that for the benefit of the ecosystem, beginning with their very own community.